Hey everyone, welcome back to another Tic Tac Taiko. I've been thinking a lot lately about the different angles that you see in Taiko. Not the angles of the drums, but the angles of the player. For example, how you hold your legs and how they're bent when you're in stance. How you hold your arms and the angles that you make here. How you cock your bachi, even the angle of the strike itself. And with all of these angles, how they affect the quality of the Taiko. There are way too many things to cover in one or even a couple of videos, so I'm going to spread these out over several different videos, maybe not back to back, but over time. Which angle am I going to talk about today? You're going to have to stay tuned to find out. Now, I would prefer to play this while standing in some sort of stance, but given that I am tall, given that my bachi are long, and given that the ceiling is not that tall, I have to compromise. I'm going to be playing on my knees because the strike itself isn't important for this week's video. The approach to the strike is. There are three different angles you can take. One is to have the tip forward, one is to have the tip up, and one is to have the tip back. And we're going to cover the pros and cons of all three. We'll start with the neutral position, where the tip of the bachi is pointed up to the sky and the butt of the bachi is pointed down. Regardless of how I move my hand, this angle doesn't change. I mean, it can, but for purposes of explanation, I want to make sure it stays up and down the whole time. If my bachi is truly straight up, directly overhead of me, and I drop it, well, you can see what happens. I'm going to hit myself. Don't want to do that. So it needs to go a little bit forward. How much so? Well, you can play with that, and we'll talk about that at the end of the video. I want it to go in front of me so that if I drop straight down, I'm not going to hit myself. But I can go all the way over the drum itself as well. This is viable. So there's a little bit of play. So I have my default playing position. The bachi is neutral. If I just let my arm go, if I just let gravity take over, that's a sloppy, inefficient, yet powerful hit because gravity is doing all the work. If I decide to control the hit at the end just a little bit, now it's in a good position to do whatever else I want. So with gravity and a neutral position, you have a pretty good strike right off the bat. It's also really important to note the three parts of your arm that are going to allow you to do a strike. Your shoulder, your elbow, and your wrist. If I only let my shoulder do the work from this position, a neutral position, it's going to fall forward. Now, I would obviously be further back from the drum to do this, but you can see that it makes an arc. And it's going forward before it goes down. So a lot of the force that I would have from this collapse is gone. It's doing forward motion and then it collapses. So that's a lot of wasted potential energy. It's also really inconvenient to do this over and over and over again. It's a lot of work for the shoulder, and after a while this motion starts to hurt, especially at any sort of speed or repetition. So instead of moving just from the shoulder, what if we also let the elbow bend? You can think of it as a pull down or a push down, but letting the elbow collapse with my bachi tip still pointed up gets me to about here. And from here, I have a couple of options. I can let the arm unfurl from here. So I start up, I collapse, it gets to this point, and then I open. It's making an arc, much like an arc here, but it's not arcing from the beginning. It's arcing after momentum has started to gather, if you will, and then it goes forward. So it's got a lot more motion, and this is a lot less wasted energy than the arc from the top here. And I'm breaking it down as a 1-2 motion, but it's never going to be like that. It's going to be a 1-1. It's going to be a smooth, straight, and then forward. This sort of shape. I don't know what kind of shape that is, but it's definitely a smooth, not a 1-2. And the other option you can do when you get to this point is to make sure the bachi stays up, bend the wrist until you hit your maximum flexibility. I can't make my wrist go any further without adjusting my body. So elbow dictates how low this part goes. Wrist dictates how low this part goes, and then I let it go forward. So the arc is here versus here versus here. It's here. So no matter what, you're going to have an arc. The question is, when do you let that arc happen? If you wait and let the wrist bend, then not only are you getting a shorter arc, which means so much more momentum has gathered by this point, but you're also getting the wrist snap. You can't snap the wrist. You can't get that whipping motion unless your wrist is cocked. When it's at the elbow and unfurling this way, you may not get much wrist at all. It's okay, but it's nowhere near as powerful, or I would argue as efficient, as letting the wrist bend and then whipping forward. You get the full collapse, everything is waiting until the last moment, all that potential energy whips forward. If you're bending the wrist until you can't anymore, you're creating a small top and a large bottom S. So you've got the C here, you've got a drop in forward here, and you've got an S at the end if you're using your wrist. And the S indicates that the wrist snap is happening. It's coming back just to whip forward. Just like if you were using a whip, and most of us have never actually used a whip, but you have this feel. It comes back before it goes forward, back before it goes forward. It doesn't have to, but even if I don't pull it back, it wants to come up versus back. It wants to do that when you have momentum. So noting that S is there is going to come in really handy when we get to the next angle. All right, let's talk about tipping the bachi forward. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can either tip from the wrist, or you can just simply move the arm forward and the bachi is tipped forward from here. It's different from initiating from a neutral position because at this point it's traveling. Starting from this position is a lot different. And whether your hand is forward or more back, you should play with this. Just like I said, you should play with the position of your hand when you're doing the neutral angle as well. For both the tip forward and the neutral position, how far your hand is from your shoulder will affect how much force is going into the drum. Everything's going to go down, but remember, there's arcing forward to go down, and then there's collapsing straight in. This one is way more powerful in terms of what gravity is doing, and this one is a little less. It's dissipating as half of it is going forward. So if my hand is far away and my bachi tip is forward and I decide to pull down, all of this is now in a way dissipated weight, versus here it's more concentrated. There's a smaller or larger corridor depending on where your arm is positioned. And this again isn't unique to the bachi forward, but it's something that you want to think about because bachi forward also tends to be hand forward as well. If I'm playing bachi forward and I just let my shoulder do the work, well, I get the arc just like I did when I was starting here. Instead of starting from here, I'm starting from here, but it's traveling the same way. So there's no purpose in playing from here and then just letting it arc down. You're kind of defeating having a different grip. Instead, think of that pull or that push, that collapse, things going down rather than things going forward. If I bring my elbow down and I make sure my bachi isn't coming back until it has to, then I'm going to wind up making this really big S. Remember the S I talked about earlier? The S from a neutral position tends to be a lot smaller on top, but the S from the forward tip position tends to be much, much bigger. It's going back as far as it can, and then it's going to almost bounce off of this position. And this big S, the big bounce, is happening because I'm initiating and I'm pulling, and as you can see, when I pull, the bachi is coming back anyways. That's just with the arm. I'm not really getting my wrist all that involved. When I let my wrist also bend, it's coming back. I'm hitting myself actually. Coming back to almost an extreme position. And if I really, really cock my wrist forward at almost an extreme angle and I pull, I'm going to get maximum distance back, and then it's going to whip forward. And because of this, I consider the forward tip angle to be a much more advanced technique. There are three things you want to watch out for when using the tip forward angle. Number one is overhitting. It's really easy to generate way more power than you need. And that doesn't just make the sound not so good, you can also damage the drum. You've got momentum from your arm, you've got gravity helping, and you have this immense whip from the wrist snap. So you want to be careful. Two, you also don't want to control so much that you're gripping really tight. That sort of defeats the purpose of having the extra snap from the tip forward. And three, you may not be used to the amount of force that's going in or coming back. It might bounce out of your hand, it might recoil in a weird way. So as you practice this, don't worry about coming from a full strike. Maybe try it a little lower. You can still get the same dynamics without having to worry about generating all that much force. But it is potentially a much stronger strike than the neutral angle. As for the third option, where the bachi tip is back, I'm just going to come out and say it. This is the worst of the three. And the further back it goes, the more exponentially bad the strike is going to be. For a lot of new Taiko players, the default grip is put bachi in hand, make fist, lift arm. And the angle might differ, but it still tends to be on the back side. Now, if I'm trying to drop the arm like I did with the neutral position, I'm going to hit myself. And I'll show you from this angle, not so good. I have to move the arm out about here before I can drop it. And this is not very realistic, right? This is just not going to happen. So the further out I move it, the more I have to cock it up so it becomes this. Now I can drop it without hurting myself. But again, it's not about how far the arm is from the body, it's the angle of the bachi. So why do I think this is so bad? Let me tell you. With my bachi angled back, I have to push it or throw it forward because again, otherwise it's always going to be back. It has to go forward somewhat. In doing that, I'm expending the energy that would go into a wrist snap right at the beginning. So that's peaking up here. And if it's further back, it's peaking even further back. So even at a gradual angle back, I have to make it go forward. And then at this point, it's most likely going to arc early on. I have never seen anyone ever do a back angle forward and then somehow convert it to the forward tip version, which then comes back and forward. I've never seen forward, back, forward. You can make this happen very artificially by moving the bachi back and forth. But there's so much effort, and really, why? Why go through that? Now, having spent about a minute saying why you shouldn't have the bachi tip going back, there is a way to make it work. If the bachi tip is back, and I throw the elbow towards the drum, forward and down, it's starting to move the tip of the bachi away from my shoulder, and it gets to a position where my wrist is cocked. This is very similar to the other two angles we've talked about. And from here, I can get a wrist snap. But I'm not able to use gravity anywhere as well as when I'm here or any of these configurations. So it's possible to get a good strike. But I will almost guarantee you that you'll get a better strike from here. And those who are able to get a good strike from here are probably able to do it because they've got a good strike from here. It's really hard to get a good strike if this is your default. You can think of my idea this week as a theory. This works better, this doesn't work as well, and to try to disprove that theory in the scientific method, I'm taking it away from beta and moving it to naname and seeing if the results still hold. It may not be as clear from this angle at where my bachi tip is, but I'm going to start with a neutral position where the butt of the bachi is pointed more or less towards the drum. Does this still work? Let's see. I bring the bachi down like gravity was pulling it towards beta. I let the elbow collapse. I let the wrist collapse, and I get a snap. Pretty easy to do. I can't use as much gravity as I did with beta because I'm going at an angle, so maybe I'm using momentum or turning the hips, but this is my baseline. Now, if I don't bend the elbow, if I throw it forward like I talked about the large arc, I mean, I can do it. It doesn't feel as good. Feels like I'm using a lot of shoulder, just like we talked about when I was doing beta. And if I only bend at the elbow and not so much at the wrist, it's okay, not horrible. But I feel so much more power and so much more efficiency by letting everything collapse. Next, let's try bachi tip forward, a little bit of that cocked wrist. I'm gonna collapse everything. Okay. Feels about the same. Elbow, wrist is still bent, and then opens up and then comes back down, getting that S. It feels just like it did when I was doing it beta, except there's not as much gravity to help, and I have to use a little bit more of whatever to get it where I want to go. And that leaves me with bachi tip back, and there's a couple of ways I can hold it here, more of a fist, more open, but bachi tip is back. Now if I throw it forward, I mean, I can get a good amount of power by using my body, but this way, the throw, I'm using my shoulder again. I can feel it already being kind of tense. And if I do it as best as I can, best possible strike by collapsing, it's okay. It just feels like there's something missing, something I could do better. And if you don't believe me or you're curious how this feels, try it on your own. And again, it's not about the strike and hitting. It's about preparation and execution. So you can have anything here, even if it's a mattress or a pillow, just to feel it going in. How you end doesn't matter. And let's take a look at Odaiko as well. If you've got the beta as 0, Odaiko is 90. And just like you moved the bachi orientation with Naname, you're going to move it as well with Odaiko. Big difference here is the human body is not made to have the bachi go back at a 90-degree with the arm extended. It's not going to happen. What you wind up with is people doing A, pulling back with the bachi pointed back. Bachi tip forward towards the drum is the exact same angle as when you have the bachi neutral with beta below. Remember, it's not the position of the arm, we're talking about the angle of the strike. And the other position is the bachi tip towards the drum. Again, doesn't matter what angle the arm is, which is very similar to the beta being here and the bachi tip forward. If I really cock my wrist and I pull the arm back, you've seen this as well, I certainly have, and then strike into the drum. You might say or argue, yeah, but sometimes I see the bachi back here before the strike. And yes, that's true, but that's in execution of the strike, not in the positioning of where you start. Starting from here doesn't feel good. This position is exactly the same as striking down with the bachi tip pointed back, with all the issues that you're going to have with that. When the bachi goes backwards, it's because it's part of the path. And if my shoulder wasn't here, it wouldn't look like it's curling around my back. It would just have that S shape that we've been talking about. Now that you have this information, what do you do with it? Well, I have a couple of ideas. The first and most important is to be aware of how you angle your bachi. Are you more forward? Are you more neutral? Are you actually going back? It's really important for you to know. And if it's hard to figure out because you're thinking about it too hard, go watch an old practice or an old performance. That will tell you the truth. Once you figure this out, now you can start to play with it. You can start to see how differences affect your taiko. Remember how I said you can have the bachi at the same angle, but your hand can move forward or back, closer or further away. Play with that. Start to understand how that affects your performance. And you also want to start experimenting with the other angles. For example, if you're used to the neutral position, try playing forward, try playing back. Why would you want to go back if I said it's not a good striking angle? Because A, you identify what it feels like within your body so that if it happens by accident, you know what it feels like, you know to adjust it. But also, maybe you're teaching students or will be teaching students who do play like this, and playing like this yourself, at least for a little while, helps you understand what they're feeling, and now you share a language that will help them get away from that angle. And so, if you like this video, let me know with a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that button down there. And until next time, keep on practicing and be well.